So why don't we just do our motivation? Are we going to offer a mandala? No, we don't offer a mandala. Do we offer a mandala? No. No. Okay, fine. So we just start with our little motivation, thinking, "Oh, you're okay, good. Why not?" Prayer to Shakyamuni. You do that prayer, do you, John?
Yes. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer. Excuse me. The one gone beyond.
Can't hear anybody.
Okay, let's try that again. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect knowledge and good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge.
Okay.
This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kamniyataya.
So now we can do our little motivation here. So we, the first 2 lines we can see we're reminding ourselves of refuge, which we've just done, but we can do it again. And the second 2 lines, this is where, because we're on the Mahayana path, we're stating our motivation, which is bodhicitta, basically. You know, we're saying, actually, we're listening to the Dhamma, that's right. So the first 2 lines, Sangye, Chodang, Soke, Chognam La, Jancho Badu, Dagni, Kyapsu Chi, and the second 2 lines are expressing our motivation. So by the virtue we create by listening to these teachings, we then think maybe we become a Buddha, so we can be of more benefit of all sentient beings. Dagi Chunyangi Personam Ki Drola Penche Sangye Drupa Shog Sangye Chodang, Soke, Chognam La, Jancho Badu, Dagni, Kyapsu Chi. Dagi Chunyangi Personam Ki Drola Penche Sangye Drupa Shog Sangye Chodang, Soke, Chognam La, Jancho Badu, Dagni, Kyapsu Chi. Dagi Chunyan Gipe Sonam Ki Drola Penche Sangye Drubpa Shog. Thank you so much, John. Okay. So compassion is interesting. It's like often what drives people to a spiritual path, I think, is this wish, is this thought of compassion, love, compassion to develop, you know, that's one of the most, it's the main motivation, I think, for many people. But what's interesting in the Buddha's view, you know, if we look at the Lam Rim, this marvelous packaging of Buddhist teachings that Tsongkhapa in the 14th century put together, taken from all the vast body of knowledge that, you know, in the Nalanda tradition, as His Holiness Dalai Lama tells us, we are, that from all the teachings and of the great body of knowledge from the last up right back to the time of the Buddha, you know, Tsongkhapa, he put together this Lam Rim, this packaging, and he put all the teachings together from an experiential point of view, and therefore from the point of view of the capacity of the disciple, which is just how we learn everything. I mean, you go to grade 1, grade 2, and you go to high school, then you go to college, then you graduate. I mean, we understand really, really well, but it's surprising to hear that this spiritual path is the same way. So in that framework, then if you want to use junior school, high school, and university as the analogy, then compassion is advanced, you know. Compassion is university level, college level. So that's surprising to us because we think that's the entry level, but it absolutely is not. So there's a term we use in the West a lot, self-compassion. Buddhism wouldn't have that term. It's like a contradiction because compassion doesn't necessarily have to do with the self, but we get that. And it's a really good phrase if we think that, self-compassion. But what's interesting is the first levels, the first stages of practice, which is really all the nuts and bolts of Buddha's teachings about abiding by the laws of karma, getting renunciation, giving up attachment, which all sounds very kind of serious. That's really that's the work you do. That's the self-compassion wing. This word needs two wings, wisdom and compassion. That's the wisdom wing. That's the first two scopes of the Lam Rim, and it's all about ourself. So when we think of self-compassion, we think of having a massage and a good lie down, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if we take this view, the Buddhist view, the first stages of practice, they won't call it self-compassion. They call it developing renunciation, giving up suffering and its causes. Well, analyze that. Who is going to be giving up suffering and its causes? Well, I am. And why would I want to give up suffering? Because I'm sick of suffering. So another way of putting this, you've got compassion for yourself. So what's the method to give up suffering is by abiding by the laws of karma, stopping harming others, living in vows, doing purification, working on your mind, controlling your body, speech, and mind. So that's the method to stop your suffering. So that's the method you would use if you have even an ounce of compassion for yourself. That's Buddha's methodology for taking care of yourself, for you to become more happy and more content and more fulfilled. So self-compassion has to come first. Absolutely. And it's logical. And we're going to go into that to show the logical reasons for that. So what are they? Well, let's look. When we say the word compassion, what's the definition? Well, as we know in the Buddhist model of the mind, which we learn in the middle scope on the wisdom wing, we learn that there are deluded, ridiculous, neurotic, depressing, unhappy, suffering states of mind. The Buddhist psychology calls them afflictions. We know those well: attachment, anger, jealousy, depression. We know them intimately. Then you've got the positive states of mind: love and compassion and kindness and generosity and forgiveness. So if you like, you could say that all the first level of practice, the renunciation one, the self-compassion one, is to learn to lessen and eventually give up all the ridiculous delusions. Why? Because they cause us suffering. Then we're more qualified to develop love and compassion for others. So what's the definition of compassion? Well, it starts with a thought. They all begin with being a thought, and then you develop it and it becomes more powerful. So it's a thought. When you see suffering, you reach out and you think, oh my God, look at that suffering. So we'd call it empathy. I know in modern psychology, we used empathy one way, call it, all different definitions, but in Buddhism, effectively, empathy is compassion. You see a person suffering, your heart reaches out and you wish they didn't suffer. That's the way to define compassion. So now compassion is related to suffering. So then you've got to ask your question, what's the definition of suffering? So for that, you've got to go back to the wisdom wing. You've got to go back to the self-compassion wing. You've got to go back to the nuts and bolts of the first levels of practice. And that's Lord Buddha's teaching on the Four Noble Truths. So if you want to know, if you want compassion for sentient beings for their suffering, we better know what Buddha means by suffering. And this is the part that's difficult. Because there are three, as far as Buddha's concerned, okay, the Four Noble Truths, what are they? And he's talking to us. This is the wisdom wing. The wisdom wing, you see, the working of karma and your mind, the wisdom wing, the so-called self-compassion, it's got nothing to do with having compassion for others yet. It's first, we've got to put ourselves together first. It's a really clear point. So in the Four Noble Truths, and Buddha's talking to us, first he announces there is suffering. But this is the point. He identifies three levels of suffering. The first one is called the suffering of suffering. And simply speaking, it's when the bad things happen. And we all are very familiar with that. So when you hurt your knee, when your husband leaves you, when you get tortured, the most mild level to the most intense level, that's what Buddha refers to as the first level of suffering. Now, as far as we are concerned, that's the only suffering. And so when we have compassion for sentient beings, they're the only ones we have compassion for are the ones who are the victims, who are being the dog who's getting kicked, the child being abused, the innocent victims in a war, people who are poor, people who are sick, people who are harmed by others. That's the only group we have compassion for. And it's just plain too limited. Buddha's view of compassion is outrageous. And in order to understand that, we have to go back to the Four Noble Truths and look at the second and the third kind of suffering. And Buddha is referring to us right now. So we have to first recognize these 3 levels of suffering. Then we go to the second noble truth, and he announces what the causes of this suffering are. And as we know very well, there are 2 main causes, and they're both inside me, shockingly enough. They're not the person outside, but it's my past karma that set myself up for this suffering. And it's my delusions, my neuroses, that caused me in the first place to even do the actions I did in the past that are now ripening as my suffering. So this is the analysis that Buddha has. So then that's just the first kind of suffering is already pretty intense, because we cause it. So when you have that view, forget the second and third kind of suffering, when you even have that view for yourself, which is what I'm referring to very consciously as Buddha's view of self-compassion, although they don't use that phrase, it's because of my past karma that I am now suffering, and because of my delusions that I'm now suffering. And that's the part that's pretty intense, because the very first thing we think of is if I'm suffering, it's because of somebody else. I'm this innocent victim to whom bad things happen. And then we revert that. We refer then to sentient beings, and we have the same view. There's an innocent victim, and then the next minute we're angry with the person who caused it. Well, that's profoundly limited level of compassion for the Buddha. And also it's not valid compassion, because it turns into anger, because we believe we only have compassion for innocent victims, speaking very bluntly. And the Buddha says, we're all in the same boat, honey child. There's no such thing, if you like. We're going from life to life to life, harming and being harmed, harming and being harmed. Equally, karma also refers to happiness and the good things, but here we're discussing the suffering. So when we get it down for ourselves in the Four Noble Truths, even the understanding of the first kind of suffering, that is due to past karma, I set myself up for it, already we become much more compassionate towards ourselves, because we are sick of suffering and we don't want the future suffering. So we learn to give it up. We learn to purify our karma. We learn to live in our vows. We learn to look at our mind, and we really become a more marvelous, content, fulfilled human beings. That's Buddhist practice, fundamental. And that's really what I'm saying consciously is, what we would think of as self-compassion. So it's a pretty tough work. It's not just having a massage and being nice to yourself and having a cup of tea. Nothing wrong with that. It's giving up suffering, which is your own karma and your delusions. So when you know that yourself, and I'm only talking the first kind of suffering, now even your view of the suffering of the sentient beings in the world is already very, very different. Because this is what happens now. You're going to see the child being harmed, and you will automatically have compassion for them. But now, because you understand that child was, they're 5 years old now, but 6 years ago, they were in some ugly bloke's body and they were causing suffering. And now as a child, they're receiving the results of it. That view becomes very common for us. So we have extra compassion for the child because they cause their own suffering from a past life. Now, we don't like that in the West. That sounds so heavy to us. But you know what? We'll also have compassion for the present child's father who is beating that child, because we know they were reversing roles. In a past life, it was something else. They would harm. The victim was the harmer was the victim. This is a huge view that really takes us time to get hold of in the West. And we don't particularly like it, But if we don't have that view first for ourselves, we won't really want to give up harming others, because why should I? I'm an innocent victim. And, we think that way. And then we only will have this narrow compassion for suffering sentient beings whom we feel deserve our compassion, because guess what? They're innocent victims. It's just too narrow. So even having the understanding of karma profoundly changes our view for ourselves, and now for sentient beings, for others. We'll have much more profound compassion, both for the victim, but also for the perpetrator, because we know they're in the same boat together. This is a very powerful view, and it really takes us time unless we properly think about it. But that's really what Buddha's referring to on the compassion wing. When you think about bodhisattvas and we think about how we're trying to get compassion for every sentient being, we say all these words so nicely. Then when you think about it, you mean Mr. Trump? You mean the pedophiles? Oh, excuse me. We don't want to think about it. We've got to think it through. And the only way we can understand that the pedophile is suffering, Mr. Trump, well, you might like Mr. Trump, but let's just say you don't like him. The politicians are suffering. This is the point of the Buddha, and this is the second and the third levels of suffering. When we get this down with the Four Noble Truths in the very second scopes of practice, then we really have an accurate view of Buddha's worldview, basically, of what suffering is and how we cause it. And that's the basis of real compassion. Then we really can grow on the bodhisattva path, And this is what takes time. So the compassion we have, like I'm summarizing, the compassion we have now is really limited. And the tragedy is it often just turns into anger because we're convinced we've got to find the person who caused the suffering. So the compassion doesn't last. Or the compassion, we have compassion for the suffering in the world, but because we don't have the view of karma down and we're not really sure why it's happening, we get distressed and exhausted and drained and depressed. So karma is a fundamental starting point to help us understand ourselves, to help us understand, and to help us, crucially, to help us develop this profound level of compassion of the bodhisattva path. And that's what Buddha's talking about. This is the compassion of the bodhisattva path, you know. It's pretty intense. So we can't just separate compassion from everything else. It's totally integrated into the entire path. And it takes a lot of unpacking and unraveling and careful thinking about it and careful analysis. I mean, we know all these words, but it really takes time to internalize it, such that when you do hear about a person who's a pedophile, yeah, put them in prison. Absolutely. Protect them from harming themselves and others, but you're going to be able to have compassion for them. And that's really a tough one for us, a really tough one. So an even more simple understanding of that, forget even karma, okay? Forget karma. I think there's a profound way that we can learn to understand why a pedophile is suffering. Forget even karma. And this is and this will again only come when we've really worked hard on our own minds and understand our own pain. And this is Buddha's very simple point. So in the Four Noble Truths, there are two main causes of my suffering. One is the past karma that I created that set me up for it. But the other one is the delusion in my mind, the attachment, the anger, the jealousy, the whatever it is, that informed my past action and which I'm experiencing now. So when we can understand, and this is where we forget even karma, we really learn, as Lama Zopa puts it, or Lama Yeshe, to become our own therapist, which is the middle scope after karma. Karma is the ground level. Karma is the basis. Control your body, control your speech, live in vows, and purify. The next level, we learn to become our own therapist, as Lama Yeshe puts it. We really begin to become a Buddhist now. We learn to become familiar with our mind. Crucially, we learn to become familiar with attachment. This is massive, absolutely massive teaching of the Buddhas, you know. So when we understand attachment, and remember, Buddha's telling us, Robina, honey, that's why you're suffering, then we begin to understand it, then we will only want to give it up because we can't stand the pain. And then if we're suffering from attachment, because anger is the main response when attachment doesn't get what it wants, then we're going to see our anger and our aversion and our frustration and our annoyance and our depression. And then we're going to see that that is causing us suffering. And then on the result of that, we get jealous and that causes us suffering. And then we get angry and we hurt people as a result of it. So when we know our mind is the source of our suffering, our delusions, we feel the pain of our depression, the pain of our jealousy, the pain of our anger and attachment, and own that. That's when we really begin to have self-compassion. That's when we really begin to have renunciation. Now you can see the pain of your own mind, your crazy mind, uncontrolled mind, deluded mind, and this takes time. Now I can understand. Can you imagine? I mean, just think about it. Can you imagine thinking, having thought because of your own part, your own uncontrolled mind? You can't stop thinking about jumping on little girls, or you can't stop thinking of torturing somebody. I mean, the best we can do is think of cake all day. But can you imagine being born, again, yes, due to karma, where you are thinking of harming others all day? I mean, there's a friend of mine on death row in Kentucky. I always quote this. My friend Mitchell is a very devoted Buddhist, and he knows the guys on death row. He's like their friend. There's about 40 of them, you know, all in their red jumpsuits on death row in Kentucky. And there's one fellow, I know him, I go there to teach. I haven't been for a while, but I used to go every year and give a class. And one of the fellows there who comes to the classes, I know him, he's very laid back, looks very relaxed. And Mitchell told me, he said, Robina, he thinks of torture all the time. So this is the point about the mind. We don't have this view in our culture. If we think of a person thinking of torture all the time, they are evil and they should go to hell. Because we have no analysis of why he's thinking of torture all the time. You know, and we assume he's an evil person. That's about the best we can say. But when we understand karma, that we came into this life programmed with our tendencies. So can you imagine the nightmare of you? And it's bad enough being attached to cake, bad enough to being attached to a person, or attached to get what you want all the time, or attached to comfort. But can you imagine being attached to torturing people? And that's the habit in the mind. Then when you know your own mind and you know your own suffering coming from attachment and anger, now you're able to understand the pain of someone who has got complete terrible addictions on the basis of which they harm others. Now we understand we can have compassion for a person who's got attachment to alcohol. Because you know why? Because they only harm themselves. But in our culture, as soon as you lift a finger to harm others, nobody has any compassion for you whatsoever. You're evil and you deserve to suffer. That's heavy. We feel like that, But if you, again, another point, when you see in your life anything you've ever done, even slight things, to harm another, it wasn't when you're feeling compassion, was it? It wasn't when you're feeling peaceful. It wasn't when you're feeling loving. It wasn't when you're feeling joyful. It was when you're feeling angry, depressed, hurt, resentful, or jealous. In other words, we only harm others because of delusions. Well, guess what a pedophile is? They harm others because of their delusion. Guess what a torturer is? They harm others because of their delusions. They just happen to be more intense delusions, that's all. So this is all the analysis we have to do in the first stages of practice. And if we miss this, we just can't have this understanding of compassion. It makes no sense to have a compassion for a torturer. It makes no sense to have compassion for a pedophile, And then the other point is, because we think of compassion as something soft and gooey, oh, the poor thing, he's suffering. Then we think we've got to pat the person on the head and go, oh, well, the poor torturer, he's suffering. That's not like that. That's sentimental rubbish. Compassion's fierce. Compassion of the bodhisattva, they see the mind of the person, they know their delusions, they know why they're harming others. And so, of course, you're going to put them in prison if you have to. Of course, for their sake, you will prevent them from harming others. It's not some sentimental thing. We think Mr. Trump, the poor thing, he's suffering. Well, therefore, he kind of get him off the hook. It's not like that. Compassion is fierce, and it's based on wisdom. It's based on the earlier stages of practice. It's much more profound than we can think, And it's not just, you can't force it. You've got to have the logic of the teachings and think about it and meditate on it and to know your own suffering first. That's the Four Noble Truths. And if we don't apply it to ourselves and really understand our suffering at a deeper level, understanding the delusions and the nightmares of the misery of our minds, and then want to give them up, we cannot have this level of compassion. It just doesn't, it won't make sense to us otherwise. This is the major point to understand, So because it's a more advanced teaching. It's the great scope. It's a more advanced. You can't possibly leap into university math if you haven't done junior school and high school. And junior school is abiding by the laws of karma, and high school is knowing your mind. That's the nuts and bolts of Buddhist teachings, that we have to apply. And that's the thing that I think we do find the hardest in our culture. When we think of karma, we sort of think of it as heavy, like I'm being punished. Because we've got the Christian view and the Muslim view of a creator. It's the dualistic view that the creator religions have. I'm not criticizing. And we just plonk that into the Buddhist one. So we just get guilty and feel bad. That's useless. It's totally useless to feel that way. You've got to be kind to yourself. Self-compassion, seriously. You've got to see your rubbish mind, see your delusions, see how they cause you pain, see how they cause you to harm others, even just the simple level that we do. We mightn't be a pedophile. We mightn't be a torturer. Then we can begin to understand sentient beings and not just have compassion for the innocent victims. But in the end, even the bodhisattvas would have more compassion for the harmer than the harmed. Why? Very logical. Because the harmed has just finished their karma by being harmed, and the person who is harming them is just beginning their future suffering. This is the logic of it. This is the level of, this is why the bodhisattva compassion is so intense. It's not just because they're kind of weird people. They've done the wisdom wing first. You can't avoid it. As His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, compassion is not enough. You've got to have wisdom. And wisdom is what you get from the nuts and bolts of abiding by the laws of karma and working on your mind and being fed up by your own suffering. You know, yourself, when it comes to the body, we really understand it. You go to your, you go to your doctor and she says, Robina, you better stop smoking. You're going to, why should I? Because, sweetie pie, you're going to get cancer. And she'll show me the disgusting lungs. She'll show me the videos of cancerous lungs. So she's not saying, if you don't stop smoking, I'll give you cancer. No, she says, you will get cancer. So she's out of kindness telling me to do this difficult job of giving up an addiction because I don't want future suffering. That we miss completely. We just think, I've got to be a good person. I've got to abide by the laws. I've got to do this. I've got to do that. We're very kind of punitive with ourselves because we haven't properly thought through karma, And we haven't gone deep enough into our own mind, the suffering of the delusions, Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, that when we've got renunciation, which is the accomplishment of the first stages of practice, and when we've really got renunciation, which is an advanced level, forget emptiness, forget bodhicitta, he said, when we've really achieved renunciation, the sign of it is that just the thought of another moment of attachment, just the thought of another moment of attachment is so disgusting. It's like being in a septic tank. So, I mean, that's heavy duty. None of us think this, which shows how deep attachment is, because we just kind of confuse it for love and pleasure. We don't even think attachments are suffering. We might go, oh, I'm so attached, I like chocolate cake. That's about the best we can say, because we haven't really begun the deeper work of drilling down into our own mind and seeing the pervasiveness of attachment, the depth of it, the profundity of it, the subtlety of it. And that just takes time, Then we're going to have compassion, not just for the victims, not just for the pedophiles, but for ordinary people looking like they're happy. Because this is getting us to the second kind of suffering, which Buddha calls the suffering of change, which is the suffering of attachment, basically. So the suffering of change sounds kind of boring, but what it means is, okay, if the suffering, the first kind, is when the bad things happen, that one we understand. Then the suffering of change is what we mean by happiness. So it's shocking to hear that for Buddha, that this is a more pervasive, more subtle level of suffering, much harder to recognize, and it's quite advanced. We sort of know our attachment is a suffering, but we don't really, because we so mix it with love, we mix it with liking something, we mix it with joy and pleasure. We can't distinguish it, We haven't gone deep enough into our hearts to see it. So this is the second kind of suffering, the suffering of change. So why does he call it the suffering of change? It's very simple. So there you are with attachment. Keep simple. It's the chocolate cake. Very simple. Attachment is this emotional hunger, this assumption that I'm not enough, assumption that I'm missing something. So it dumps itself onto the chocolate cake. And then the assumption of attachment now is all this excitement, the anticipation of getting the chocolate cake, because the attachment believes that when I get the chocolate cake, I'll get happy feelings. Now, Buddha's saying you will get happy feelings, but our problem is we believe, even without analyzing it, that somehow it'll be happiness, and we want it to last. We know from our experience that happy feelings don't last. Well, nor do unhappy feelings. They're all impermanent. But the craving of attachment is this desperate hunger for happy feelings to last. We want them to last. We somehow desperately think they will last, And so when you eat, this is the analogy. This is the analysis a little bit. So there's attachment, there's emotional hunger, anticipating the cake, all building up, all excited. You get the cake, you put it in the mouth. Now we know that first mouthful, when the cake meets the sense consciousness, the pleasure that is triggered is really very delicious. There's no doubt about that. But this is the tragic part. As we're experiencing the pleasure of the contact of the object and the sensory object, the sense, even as we're experiencing it, attachment is right there next to it, and already it is not satisfied. It's not satisfied. Even for that first moment of pleasure, attachment is already anticipating the second mouthful. because attachment is this complete junkie that just is literally never satisfied. So even as you're having that first mouthful and the pleasure that it is triggering is definitely true, it is pleasure, but attachment, this like the greedy little child, I mean, something mean, we've all got it, already is not happy with that moment of pleasure and is hungrily anticipating the second mouthful, hoping the next moment will bring more pleasure. But we all know, when you look back on your experience, that first moment of pleasure is the best. Already the second mouthful, you're hungrily anticipating the pleasure more, but it's actually less pleasure. But we're not still, attachment's not satisfied, and we're not listening to ourselves. So again, the emotional hunger, the attachment, still not satisfied, greedily wants another mouthful, always hoping that more happiness will come. But we know what will happen. It's happened every day of our life, but we forget every day. The pleasure is going down with each mouthful. We're getting a bit more desperate, still hoping the next mouthful will do it, but we know it won't. And by the time you get to the second piece, the third piece, if you ate another piece, now the pleasure has inexorably turned into pain, and you would vomit if you had one more piece. So we have to do the analysis, and this is scientific analysis. This is not religion, but we never do the analysis because it's totally programmed in us. So that's the meaning of the suffering of change. So in fact, it's more the suffering you get of the full stomach, the stuffed stomach, when you've been driven by this craving attachment, is kind of even more painful because you are anticipating happiness. The happiness is gone, disappeared, the first mouthful, second, gone. You keep waiting for more, and all you get now is you want to vomit and you get diarrhea, or the next day. But the next day you forget all about the diarrhea and the full stomach, and you start craving the cake again, thinking maybe this time it will do it. And Buddha says we've been basically bashing our heads against brick walls like this for eons. This is the suffering of change. So that's happy people. It's not sarcastic, it's not mean. That's a tiny example of one. So one example of one moment of the way attachment works, getting the object, the pleasure coming, and then gradually it diminishes. So use the boyfriend as the example, If attachment mainly runs your relationship, then it's very delicious in the beginning. We know that. It's incredibly delicious. The pleasure that's coming is really delicious. But if it's mainly attachment and not much love or compassion, then it'll be very delicious in the beginning, but it won't be satisfied either. And then no matter how much pleasure comes from contact with the boyfriend, it will never be enough. And then you start to find fault and you criticize, and one day you wake up and think, who's this ugly bloke in my bed? Get out. And you get another one. This is the suffering of change. Some people's relationships last 50 years. Because why? Not because of attachment, but because there's virtue there. And that's our saving grace. So in our relationship, if there is attachment, that part will never cause you happiness. What causes you happiness, if there is any happiness, is because of love and patience and kindness and forgiveness and generosity. They're the source of our happiness in a relationship. So we've got to do this analysis, both theoretically and then in meditation, to really become familiar with the incredible suffering of this attachment. But it sounds kind of cynical. And I mean, on the face of it, it sounds brutal, because we assume attachment is pleasure. They're different states of mind. They're completely different states of mind. So we've got to really do the analysis carefully, and slowly, we will see the pain of attachment and want to give it up. Then, of course, we now go to look at other people. And so whom do we have compassion for now? Well, the happy people, the rich people, the beautiful people, the nice people who've got a lovely family and money in the bank and lovely parents and nobody harms anybody. They've got heavenly lives. We're going to have compassion for them too, if they're driven by attachment, because the pleasure that is coming on the basis of contact with the money and contact with the husband and contact with the children, the pleasure is true pleasure. It's true, but it's driven by attachment. So eventually it will run out. It will change into the suffering of suffering. If we do this analysis in our lives, we will see that this is true. It's provable, but we don't want to think about it. It's too painful, Are we communicating? So we don't know this for ourselves. How can we have compassion for sentient beings? The only ones we'll have compassion for are the innocent victims, a few dogs and a few children. That's it. And it won't last. Are we communicating that point? This is the prelude to my talking about compassion. Then when we begin to understand the Bodhisattva teachings and the outrageous levels of compassion they have, and we do the 8 verses and go through these insane levels of compassion, now we understand why. You've got to have it for yourself first, which is understanding the Four Noble Truths. That's what renunciation is, you know. That was the thing I wanted to say first. It's so important to understand this, to give it, in other words, to see compassion in the framework of the entire path, you know. So another whole aspect of this, if we haven't done the inner work, we can see this, you know, we can see one of the major problems in our life is we do have compassion. We see the suffering of the world. This is an incredible quality to have empathy for the pain of others, even at the first level. There's no doubt it's a marvelous quality. But look what happens. It either makes us angry, and we try to find who to blame. That was my style. So I'd go off into political activity, 10 years of really intense political activity. I mean, I meant well, you know, I was a radical feminist. I was before into black politics before that, into the left, radical left before that, all of that time, 60s and 70s, you know, and I was totally devoted to my practice, totally devoted to my committed to my political activity, completely 100%, you know. I definitely had compassion for suffering. I had compassion for black people, compassion for white people. I mean, compassion for women, compassion for anybody who was suffering, the victims, right? I did have that. But it was mixed with anger, because the political approach is there's a group suffering and you've got to find who's causing it. So then all the anger is what fueled my political activity, you know. I remember His Holiness Dalai Lama was asked one time, the journalist said, well, anger looks really good. It looks like it's energizing. It makes you act. And Dalai Lama said, I know what you mean. But he said, if you're mainly motivated by anger, it won't last. And that's a fact. All the political activists I was working with in the 60s and 70s are all fat and lazy and couldn't care less now. They've given up because anger doesn't sustain. It doesn't last. You get fed up, so you give it up, you know. So this is what's hard. So as His Holiness said, if you're driven by compassion, you never give up. So compassion is this bigger view we're having, which is the view that everybody's in the same boat. Everybody is suffering, which takes time to see. So the point I'm getting at is this. Another kind of person, like as a friend of mine, who, you know, like these days, it's, I mean, I remember when I was in my youth, it was other issues. It's the same damned issues every generation. We can see that. But, you know, then it became, now these days it's more environmentalism. We never discussed that then, you know. So now there's a friend of mine who's, you know, a different generation. She is, you know, very active in the environmental movement. So what happens with her when she sees all the suffering, she doesn't get overtly angry. So what she gets instead is depressed. You get my point here? So it's all aversion, because when we understand attachment is what drives all of us, the neurotic part. And when it doesn't get what it wants, now my style of aversion, because anger is the response when attachment doesn't get what it wants, but my level of anger was active and shouting and yelling, but my friend's was more internal. And that's what depression is. Depression is a buildup of thwarted attachment. So this is the point I'm trying to get to. I'm going to get to the point now. I'm getting to the point. So when I saw suffering, you know, who caused this suffering? And I went out and demonstrate, you know, I was very noble. I demonstrated all my life. I was always my first thing. I didn't even have a proper job. I was always out there demonstrating, working for the poor, working for the black, working for the women, blah, 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 all that kind of thing. Very noble, blah, blah. But it was anger that fueled me as well as compassion. Now, my friend, because anger or aversion is the bare bone state of mind that is the response when attachment doesn't get what it wants. These two of the 3 poisons, the way Buddha talks, they sound so cute to us. So attachment, anger, how boring, you know, but they are primordially deep and primordially connected. We run between attachment, getting what it wants and getting all perky and happy, and then having it thwarted and not getting what it wants and getting aversion, irritated, upset, angry, or depressed. They're all on the spectrum of aversion. So it depends on your personality. So my friend who doesn't show anger But she's got aversion when her attachment didn't get what he wanted. So when my attachment didn't get what he wanted, you know, all the poor people suffering and the black people suffering and the women suffering, I'd get angry. She, when she sees environmentalism, she'd say she'd be driving in the car with her husband, and as soon as she'd see all the trees looking terrible, she'd get panic attacks because her attachment wasn't getting what it wants. So she didn't get shouting and yelling, but it became depression and despair. It's the same problem, except with angry people, they harm others, but depressed people don't harm others. But it's what I'm getting at is it's the working of attachment and aversion together. And we've all got it. And this is the point I'm now getting to. When she saw suffering, she did have compassion, but also her attachment wasn't getting what it wanted. This is kind of brutal to say it, but this is the point we have to understand. Attachment is I-based. All the delusions are I-based. And they're working away. Then we've got the virtuous states. There's no question. We've got compassion. We have love. We have generosity. We have kindness. They're the virtues. But as long as you've got attachment, it's going to pollute your virtues. So in her case, when she saw the terrible environment, she had compassion, but her aversion took over because her attachment wasn't getting what it wanted. So she'd freak out and become depressed. I would just get angry and go and demonstrate. Now, this is the thing too. Let's say you see suffering in the world, like COVID, like Ukraine, name it. Every day of the year of your life, there's always going to be something terrible happening on this planet. We know that. So what happens is this, it's the same thing. You see the war and you have compassion, there's no doubt. But then immediately we get confused and fearful because we don't have an analysis. If you don't have the view of karma, we don't know why it's happening. So we either get angry or we get depressed. And that's the part that harms us. The depression and the anger and the fear is what arises. So we suffer not because people are suffering. Suffering does not cause us to suffer. Our attachment causes us suffering, and our aversion to the suffering causes us suffering. This is a huge point. And that's why we give up. That's why people kill themselves. I mean, look at the people, the kind, compassionate workers in the hospitals during COVID. They became overwhelmed by the suffering. Many killed themselves. You don't kill, I'm not being rude here. This is a very unique Buddhist analysis, you know. The reason we suffer when we see suffering is not because of the suffering. When we can't cope with the suffering, it's not because of the suffering, it's because we've got attachment, and attachment is this junkie in us that only wants everything to be lovely. Attachment can only cope with everything being lovely. So COVID is not lovely. The war in Ukraine is not lovely. So what arises when attachment doesn't get a lovely thing? Aversion, anger, depression. We have this panic attack. That's why we suffer. That's why when bodhisattvas have got to the level of getting renunciation, giving up attachment, giving up anger, even realizing emptiness, now they are fearless. And no matter how much suffering, they never freak out. They never give up because they don't have attachment and aversion any longer, because they are why we suffer. They are what drag us down. Are we communicating here? This is Buddhist analysis. This is not the world's analysis, I tell you. Let's say you've got an alcoholic brother. I'll just use a simple example. You've got bucket loads of compassion for him. You see the suffering he's causing himself. But what we don't see in ourselves until we really work hard is that my attachment, which is this junkie in me that only wants everything to be lovely. And how damn this damn brother upset my apple cart by being a bloody alcoholic, and now I'm all upset. So in a sense, you blame your brother for making you upset, which is what you have when you have attachment. So then the anger pollutes your compassion, and you stick your nose in, you barge into his life, you make him go to AA, and you get upset because he vomits in the soup, and you're upset about mum and dad. That's not because you've got compassion. That's because you've got attachment and aversion. They drag us down. They cause the suffering. Are we communicating here? This is a really powerful point, I tell you. And if we don't get this, then we won't really know why we suffer. In other words, other people suffering is not why we suffer. Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, COVID, the suffering, the dramas of your alcoholic brother, they are not the main cause of my upset. The cause of my upset is my attachment and my anger. This is not sort of hating ourselves. It's a revelation. That's why bodhisattvas have so much compassion. I mean, we just think they're weird. How can they not get upset? Because they've given up attachment and aversion is why they don't get upset. They only have compassion, and they are fearless and courageous and never give up. That's intense, you know. I mean, you've got to look at the Dalai Lama. I just find him the most outrageous example on this planet. If you want to quantify levels of suffering, have a look at his. Here, the poor fellow, holy fellow, was given the job of running Tibet at the age of 16, for God's sake. I mean, he had to run his country at the age of 16. Can you imagine the sense of responsibility? And then the terrible suffering from there on, non-stop. Since he was 16, we can see he has never given up trying to find solutions to Tibet. Not just Tibet now, but the world, science, religion, spiritual, politics, social, everything. He tries in every area, and he never gives up. And we can see it at the age of 86 or whatever he is now. He's this perky, happy fellow. We've got to ask the question why. If suffering is so terrible, how come he's happy? It doesn't. We should analyze this. It's because he doesn't have attachment and aversion. That's the point. They drag us down. They make us crazy. And they pollute our compassion and make us make a mess in our lives. Because attachment is like this junkie that barges into your brother's life, thinking you're being so compassionate, but it's your attachment messing up your compassion. Because you can't, basically, his being an alcoholic is making your life miserable. You've got compassion, yes, but you talk about him behind his back, you get upset with him, that's because of attachment and anger. So this is, again, the point. The very first level of practice, abide by the laws of karma, work on your mind, give up attachment, give up anger. This qualifies you now to go to the compassion wing and really grow incredible levels of compassion, just like the bodhisattvas. Are we communicating? I think I want you to ask me some questions now. So this week, we're going to discuss this point, which is the wisdom wing, but the next week, we're going to go into the techniques for getting compassion. But this is part of the process. This is the process. You know, the techniques for getting compassion are going to junior school and high school first. Do you understand? So yes, Michael, hello. You better unmute yourself, sweetheart. I can't hear you. Yes, Michael.
You're about the only teacher I've had over the years, the many years, and the Galupa lineage I've been immersed in that broaches the subject of politics and political activism and social activism. And the only one other I can think of is Robert Thurman. But and I think the Dharma coming to the West has a unique and kind of flavor to it that is, as Robert Thurman said, the 21st century Buddhist, I think he was referring to Americans or Westerners, is a political activist, must be an environmental social activist.
Yes.
And yet I seem to come up against among my Sangha, meaning my fellow people on the path here in Raleigh, that they avoid the subject of politics, and they don't want to talk about those things. And I know I can find a few, and then I kind of glom onto them, but. There seems to be this conflict between those who say you've got to get in. And the one thing I've contributed to the Democracy Out Loud group is that I said I would walk away and not partake if they continued to use, this is very early on, right after the inauguration in 2017, that they persisted in using the word anger or hate, I'm done. And they thought about it. The leader, she said, yes, that's got to happen. But still, I feel almost like, am I off track, and should I be focusing on my own practice?
No, I think I understand your point, but my feeling is in the world there are some people who aren't religious, who aren't spiritual, who also aren't political. I think it's a certain kind of person who has this I think it's a certain kind of person. So, you know, even a person, I can think of people I know who could be bodhisattvas, really incredible, but they're not necessarily politically active. So I think it's a certain kind of person who is, but I think we should be, because that really, the compassion wing is the political wing. What it means is helping people. I mean, His Holiness is completely political. It's obvious. So I think it's a question of sometimes just people's nature a little bit, but also really more, I think it is also misunderstanding the real point of the Mahayana path. I mean, I don't go out there and demonstrate too much anymore, but it really, you know, but I mean, it's definitely, I mean, I definitely see I'm a political activist in so far as being out there in the world. So, I mean, maybe another point, though, for Michael might be that we also have to broaden the definition of a political activist. So when I go and give a teaching, that mightn't look like political activism, but technically it's political activism, because you're talking about human beings and their minds. So maybe we've got to we've got to change our view of spiritual, but maybe we've got to broaden our analysis of political activism too. You see what I'm saying here? Yes. So I would say my work of even just doing this talk or talking about the mind to a group of kids, that's political activism as well. Because I mean, that's always how I talk when I talk to overt political activists. I always talk in this way about how if we're driven only by anger, it will destroy us. And so we can be most efficient and most effective if skillful, we do recognize if we give it, so it bringing the inner work into politics, but bringing the outer work into the spiritual. I mean, I totally agree. So maybe the person who might not go and demonstrate, but if they help the ant and help the dog, that's political activism, but they mightn't think of it like that. And I think it's true, though, some people just don't like it and do avoid it. But I think Robert Thurman is right. I think he's totally correct. And if we analyze it, it's logical, because the compassion wing, by definition, is activism. It's what it means. You come down from the mountains, you've got realizations, and now you join the world and help sentient beings. What else is politics but helping sentient beings, you know? So
well, it seems that when Robert Thurman spoke at the UU Church, Universalist Church here, and, you know, so many people from Kadampa Center were there, and I looked around, and you know, my friends, the nuns and the other members, there was some cringing going on. It just seemed there was just like, oh
really?
no.
That's interesting. I know. No, I think people. No, I think also it might be that just people. We have a fairly narrow view of spiritual. I think that really is the problem. We have a narrow view of spiritual. We see it as opposite to activism. I agree, and that is a mistake. It is a mistake. So maybe it's just a question of time before we start to see the relationship. You know?
Yeah. I think being a former Catholic brings a whole bunch of problems with it that make navigating this kind of
I understand.
paradox difficult.
No, I understand. I understand.
That's another subject, I know.
That's another subject. You know, I'm an old Catholic too, yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I love my Catholic upbringing. I always love my Catholic. I mean,
I do too.
I'm glad for my Catholic upbringing, and I'm glad for the convent and I mean, that's where I learned a sense of ethics, where I learned discipline. I mean, that was awful. It was difficult too. I had a hard time because I was a naughty girl. I was into trouble. But I really value my upbringing. I mean, I was so naughty when I was little. My mother had to send me to school to live there. You know, I had to join all the boarders because I was so wicked. But so, I mean, I was so grateful. I loved it. I was so happy.
I know about that.
There you go. Thank you, Michael. It's a really good point, I think.
Thank
but
you
also it's a personality thing as well. I've got a feeling it's a personality thing a bit too, maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure. But yeah, I think it's a lack of understanding for sure. I agree. Because literally compassion is the political wing. But just that we narrow our view of politics. So maybe we should broaden our view of politics and broaden our view of spiritual, and they'll get closer together. I think so. You understand? Thank you, Michael. Anybody else have a question or a point to bring up, please? No. Okay. Well then, 9 o'clock. Okay, my time is 9 o'clock. Okay, let's think. 9 o'clock. So why don't we now done that as the background? That's our background, you know, the Four Noble Truths and understanding wisdom, the wing, and understanding that's how to take care of ourselves, understanding attachment, aversion, understanding karma, blah, blah, blah. That's the basis. So now let's look let's look explicitly at the techniques for developing compassion, you know. So this is a bit like you can go to the university level and learn the explicit techniques for how to understand physics, but you know very well the groundwork is junior school and high school. So that's what the wisdom wing is. That's the junior school and high school that prepares your mind. I mean, I remember one time, as Pabonka Rinpoche says, in relation to the really outrageous levels of developing compassion, or the Lojong teachings, which we're going to get into. He said, you need to be a suitable vessel to practice this level. And what he meant is a suitable vessel to practice physics is a person who's done junior school and high school. So a person who's a suitable vessel to do Lojong is a person who's got renunciation, who's got self-compassion. I'm using that phrase consciously, you know, who's done the earlier work. But you can't just leap into the compassion wing, not from the Buddhist perspective. It's much more broad than that, you know. So, okay, as we know very well, there are two main techniques that have come down over the centuries. The six, what do they call it? The 6 cause and 1 effect, and then also the mind training one, the Lojong one, you know, exchanging self for others. These two methods that culminate in this bodhicitta. So Pabongka Rinpoche brings them together, and they come to 11 little points where you put these two techniques together. So let's look, though, first at what is bodhicitta, you know. I mean, it's one of the few words we say in, sort of keep it in Sanskrit. I don't know why we do, but somehow it gets a flavor, doesn't it? Well, bodhicitta, literally awakening thought. And what it's referring to is something really specific. It's not the equivalent of compassion. It's absolutely not that. It is the culmination of compassion. And it's this outrageous kind of paradigm shift in the mind that occurs having done all these techniques, which we're going to go through, that is got 2 parts. One is when you've got bodhicitta, not just a moment of, when you've got a genuine realization of bodhicitta, what it means is from there on, it is only others that arise in your mind. I mean, this is very, very abstract for us, and it doesn't seem possible. And frankly, I think in modern psychology, it sounds like a mental illness. So we have to understand the way they talk about it. We have to understand how you get to that point. It's kind of shocking to hear it. I mean, our assumption in modern psychology is that the I, the intrinsic I, is the basis. And if you lose that, you've lost the plot, you know. But that's exactly what we're talking here. But that's why we have to be a suitable vessel to even hear this. So bodhicitta, the first part of bodhicitta is this spontaneous, constant thought that whoever's in front of you, they're your responsibility. The ant, the dog, the pedophile, whoever it might be. And it's spontaneous because you've accomplished it. You've achieved it, you know. You can lose bodhicitta eventually until you realize emptiness, I think. But still, when you've got bodhicitta, the first part is this natural thought to benefit sentient beings. There's no longer the thought of I. You've really made this paradigm shift. The second part of bodhicitta is the long-term view, because that's when you start now working on the bodhisattva path, on the 6 perfections. And the bodhisattva has this long, fierce, long-term view that they're never going to give up benefiting sentient beings. And that's what's combined with their realization of emptiness. That's what brings them to Buddhahood. So there's this fierce determination that no matter how long it takes, they will never give up. This is the 2 main qualities of bodhicitta, you know. And it's the culmination of these stages of practice. So let's look at the starting point. And we could spend the rest of the 2 weeks just on this topic. It's a very powerful one. And each of these, you know, we know if we look at these 11 points, they've got their little heading. You know, the first one is simply called equanimity. And this is, so there are different definitions of it in Buddhist psychology, and we'll look at that. But here it's a really specific attitude. Often we mix all these terminologies up. We get them all kind of glommed together, but they're each quite specific, got a clear definition, and you get this one before you get this one, before you get that one, before you get this one. It's really quite precise. You know, we need to understand that. So equanimity in general, in the wisdom wing, you develop equanimity within yourself when you now become more stable as a result of controlling your body and speech, and as a result of really working on your mind. So you become much more stable and not up and down like a yo-yo, emotionally berserk like we normally are. That kind of equanimity is really quite special. You become much more fulfilled and content and stable. That's one way of describing equanimity. But here it's quite different. It's a same word, different definition. And this equanimity, and I'll give my way of putting it, such that when you got it, when you've achieved it, it is this heartfelt recognition that friend, enemy, and stranger are equal to each other from one point of view. They each want to be happy and they each don't want to suffer. It's quite precise, you know. That's equanimity. So it's the foundation upon which you will build everything else, and that culminates in bodhicitta. And without it, you have no foundation. So we've got to look at the logic of it. What does it mean and why do we need it? Well, you know, right. So then we have to understand suffering and happiness. One way of framing the entire Buddhist path, actually, which is the Four Noble Truths, is it's in terms of Buddha's acknowledgement, his recognition of what happiness and suffering are. So this is a very interesting discussion, actually. Let's go a bit further, because we say those words very loosely, but let's look at exactly what that means. So when we look at the Buddhist model of the mind, we study the Buddhist model of the mind more depth. We're going to see these the three categories of states of mind. As I said already, we've got the neurotic, deluded afflictions, the I-based ones that are completely self-centered, completely cut us off from others, completely causing of the suffering. Then we've got the virtues, and they're our saving grace, compassion and love and kindness. And, you know, and they're our saving grace. They're the ones we want to try and cultivate. So in fact, if we just take these two, we can frame the entire Buddhist path in terms of these two. The word Buddha is so fascinating. The word Buddha, the etymology of Buddha, is that the eradication of the first lot. This is Buddha's unique finding about the human mind. This is very shocking in modern psychology and neuroscience. There's no equivalent view. In fact, it sounds like mental illness. The Buddha has found, very simply from his own direct experience, that all these delusions, ego grasping, which you cut with realizing emptiness, attachment, aversion, and all the other thousands of neuroses, they are all, as he puts it, very simply adventitious. He has found it to be so from his own direct experience that they're not at the core of our being. They're not intrinsic. They don't define us. Therefore, they can be removed. So that's Buddha. It implies that, which is the achievement of your own nirvana, basically. Second, Da implies, and this is the compassion wing, the development to perfection of the second lot of states of mind, the virtues, love, compassion, kindness. So what Buddha has found at a conventional level, that they are at the core of our being. They do define us. They are who we really are. They are in the heart of our, you can't get rid of those. This is a really powerful point. So this categorization of all the states of mind into these first two categories, now I'll mention the third one, this is huge. And as we know from the Buddhist teachings, we're regularly going to be listening that what a Buddhist is a person who knows what to abandon and who knows what to cultivate. So you're abandoning delusions and you're cultivating virtue. This is the essence of the entire Buddhist path. Now, you've got to ask the question, why would we want to do that? It's very simple, because the delusions cause me suffering and the virtues cause me happiness. So there's this direct relationship between suffering and the delusions and happiness and the virtues. This is Buddha's entire analysis, you know, so it's almost too simple. We do not make it so simple in our culture. So Buddha has seen from his own observation that all sentient beings only want happiness and do not want suffering. I think we can prove that pretty quickly. You can look at the monkeys, the dogs, the ants, and you're going to deduce that's true. And Buddha happens to be saying is, guess what, guys? I found a method. And that's Buddhism. That's what the method is, to get rid of suffering and to get happiness. That's it. Now, let's look at where they fit into this model of the mind. These are in the third category. There's the neurotic, deluded, I-based, fear-based states of mind. There are the valid, virtuous, appropriate, useful, virtuous states of mind. And the third category, they often refer to these as positive, negative, and neutral. Negative, positive, and neutral. But neutral throws us. It kind of makes them sound like they're not important. So I prefer to call the third category the kind of the mechanical parts of the mind. They are the parts of our mind that make us function. So whether you are a murderer or a meditator, you need good concentration. So concentration in itself is, and this is what they mean by it, is neither non-virtuous nor is it virtuous, but it's totally necessary. There's another state of mind called mindfulness, which we really put all these bells and whistles on. That's got the same, in the same category. It's not a virtue. Thieves need mindfulness. It's in your development of concentration, you need to cultivate an earlier state of mind called mindfulness, which is this part of your mind that brings you back to the topic that you were doing. If you're cooking a cake and you forget what you're doing, you're lacking mindfulness. Mindfulness is an ability to bring your mind back so you can stay on track. Eventually you perfect your mindfulness, and now eventually you get concentration. So mindfulness, intention, attention, discrimination, concentration. There are many of these that, whether you're a murderer or a psychopath or a saint, you need them to do your job. In that sense, they're neither virtuous nor non-virtuous. These are really hugely important parts of our mind. Now, what's interesting is another one there. It's called feeling. Not an equivalent of what we mean by an emotion, not like that at all. It's in this category of being the mechanical parts. It's simply only three kinds of feeling. There's a happy feeling, or a pleasant feeling, or a nice feeling, or happiness. Then there are unpleasant, unhappy, suffering feelings, or suffering. Now, this is what's fascinating. Because we are so addicted to believing that happiness comes from outside, the cake, let's say, we even conflate the happy feeling with the cake. So when I tell you, say, Robina, tell me about your happiness, I will describe the cake. So not only do I believe that attachment, not only do I believe attachment that says the cake is the cause of happiness, but I even believe the cake is the happiness, because we are totally addicted to the outside world, you see. But happiness is got nothing to do with, it's not a function of a cake. It's like a joke to think of happiness comes from a cake. Happiness is a mental state. There's either sensory pleasant feelings or mental pleasant feelings. So happiness by definition is a state of mind, by definition. And there's either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So forget the neutral. Don't worry about them. There's the happiness and suffering. That's it. So this is all utterly part of the Buddha's approach, you know. So where are we getting to here? Okay. When we get to look at equanimity, why we need to cultivate this view that the person I call my friend, the person I call my enemy, and the person I call my stranger, what I'm trying to see is that they are equal to each other from this one point of view, that each of them equally only wants happy feelings, and each of them equally only doesn't want suffering feelings. So why do we want that? Because right now, so we want to eventually want all sentient beings. Eventually, after equanimity, it grows, and eventually you want all the sentient beings, all the friends, all the enemies, all the strangers. You want all of them to be happy, and you want all of them to not suffer. So the first one, wanting you to be happy, that's called love. The second one, wanting you not to suffer, that's called compassion. So right now, we do have love and compassion, but for whom? The first group only. As Lama Zopa says, it's unstable because it's obviously based on attachment. So I will adore my beloved. The person by definition in these three categories, by definition, a friend is a person who is the object of my attachment, and they do what my attachment wants. So we ought to be embarrassed by how self-centered we are. So that's the person I adore. That's the person I do love. That's the person I do have compassion for. But it's completely contingent upon you doing you fulfilling my needs. And as long as you fulfill my attachment's needs, I am prepared for you to be happy, which means I love you. And I am prepared to not want you to suffer, which means I have compassion for you. We have it, but it's only for that group. So it's totally narrow-minded. So what do I feel about the second category? That's called the enemy. And who's the enemy? By definition, a person who is proactively doing or thinking or saying things that my attachment doesn't want. And how do I feel about them? I don't want them to be happy, and I don't care if they suffer, which means I don't love them and I don't have compassion for them, generally speaking, in the world. Have a look at the world. Now, what's the third category? Well, that's 99.999% of the universe. And how do I feel about them? I couldn't care less. They could all drop dead. Why? Because they neither help me nor harm me. So they don't even exist for me. We can see this. So we ought to be embarrassed, but this is the universe. Friend, enemy, stranger is by definition the objects of the three poisons. Buddha's analysis is so integrated. It's so coherent when we understand it, So this is completely artificial, completely limiting. So equanimity is this massive view that enables us to step back, So even as we're talking here, imagine already in front of you a beloved, if you have a beloved right now, somebody you adore, right in front of you to the left, and a person in the middle whom you can't stand, and the person to the right who's boring, who's the stranger. Have them right there as we talk. So doing these meditations to accomplish these stages of these 11 points, these are all analytical meditations. They're using logic and analysis, like we're discussing, like we're talking, to argue with ego's absurd misconceptions. So they're really intense meditations, You're arguing with delusions because they're liars. Delusions are fantasy, are fantasists and liars. So you've got to use wisdom to argue with them, to prove how they're so foolish and have no basis. Just like we're doing in the discussion, So there's many methods of accomplishing equanimity. The first key thing is that you're stepping out of the equation. This is very powerful. Right now, when we see a friend, a person, a beloved, a person we're close to, because we're seeing them through the lenses of attachment, it's like they're almost an extension of ourselves, isn't it? Because that's what attachment does. It reaches out and grabs hold of that object as if it's me and mine, So attachment sees only the good things in that person, and then because they fulfill my needs, and doesn't mean they will all the time, but when they do, that's the basis for me to want them to be happy. Then the enemy. So like I use the example. Always use a silly example. Let's say it's David. David's my boyfriend. Okay. Now David's a stranger first. So David and Michael are mates. Okay. Let's pretend David and Michael are friends, and Michael tells me about his mate David, who lives down the road at number 6, that he gets terrible migraines. Now, Michael's my friend, let's say, and I hear about this David, but I haven't met the bloke. I try to be sympathetic. Oh, really? Does he? I'm so sorry. Pass the sugar, Michael. Why do I not care about David's migraines? It's because I don't know David. David has never done anything to be nice to me, and David has never done anything to harm me. That's called a stranger. It's 99% of the universe. We know that. So I try to be friendly, but it doesn't touch my heart because I don't know the bloke. Now, let's say I meet David and we fall in love and he moves me into number 6. Now look at me. Now see me. I have unbelievable compassion for David. I have unbelievable love for David. I think of him day and night, and I try to help his migraines. I spend my money. People say, Robina's so kind. She takes care of David. So now, what's the difference? Because this is the point about equanimity. If you ask the stranger, when David was my stranger, how are your headaches, David? He will tell you they are unbearable. And now you interview him when he's suddenly my friend, and his migraines haven't changed. They're the same unbearable. So in this context, just the two, the friend and the stranger, to me, completely different people. And I think about them differently because my attachment's involved in one and it's not involved in the other. When he was a stranger, I couldn't care less about his headaches. Suddenly I care. But from his point of view, which is the point of equanimity, and pretend he's the same, because in this case, he's the same friend as the stranger, there's no difference. So all the strangers who get migraines and all your beloveds who get migraines, they will describe the pain of the migraines in exactly the same way. So there's no difference between them. And now, of course, David moves, cheats on me with Mary, and he moves Mary into number 6, and so I hate him, and now he's gone from the friend category to the enemy category, and now I hope he suffers with his migraines, don't I? And I'll demand all my money back. I mean, we know what I'm talking about. So it's this emotional extreme that we live in called attachment, aversion, and indifference, which the entire universe is based on. Monkeys and dogs and ants live this way. Nobody questions it, but this is the shocking part of the body. So at first, the 3 poisons in the beginning, we're giving them up in relation to cakes and other things, but here we're giving it up in relation to sentient beings, seeing how invalid, there's no validity. It's just scientifically not valid. But it's hard to see it because we have these emotional views of love and compassion. So let's say I don't like Mr. Trump and he's in my enemy category. And then I learn to recognize that Mr. Trump is just the same as David, who is my friend right now, and they both want to be happy equally. Then I get confused and I think, well, what am I supposed to do with that? Because we have all these extra meanings upon it. All we're trying to establish is this bare fact that each of them equally wants happiness and each of them equally doesn't want suffering. And then you go through the other 11 points to get to, where you go with that. It's not quite, oh, well, then Mr. Trump did the poor thing, got off the hook. No, it's got, in other words, seeing that David wants to be happy is a fact, whether he cheats on me or not, or whether he's a psychopath. That's got nothing to do with it. It's trying to get beyond all those labels. He might be evil and he might be a saint, but that's not the issue here. It's seeing this bare bones fact that every being spontaneously, instinctively, primordially is driven by the wish to be happy and not suffer. It's a very profound, simple, recognition. And then the other practices are rooted in that equanimity. It's a huge one. So how do you practice this every day? Well, it's really simple. Let's say David's got a grandchild. I've got no idea if he has. And maybe his grandchild is a divine little Mary, who's a little saint. And then Mary wants to play with a smelly little girl next door who's ugly and picks her nose and is rude. So straight away, David's attachment's gone berserk and he adores his own little Mary and he can't stand this little girl next door. Straight away, he can think of equanimity. Well, you know what, David, give it a break, he says to himself. She wants to be happy just like my little beloved granddaughter. Maybe he watches because this little girl might even be mean, but because all we see when we have aversion is an ugly person and they're very distant from us. And all we see when we see a friend is a divine little person. So we're trying to get more objective and recognize the same humanity in both. The little kid next door has the same feelings, wants to be happy, doesn't want to suffer. So it's quite profound to see this. And so you adjust your behavior accordingly, Just because Mr. Trump wants to be happy, we tend to think, oh, well, let him be happy, let him do what he likes. That's not the point here. It's removing ourselves from the equation and getting beyond these 3 artificial labels. I mean, another way of putting it is, is oneself. You put yourself there, and then you have your friend to the left in front of you, have your enemy to the middle in front of you, and have your stranger to the right. But think of yourself. For the friend, look at your friend and look how she's looking at you with adoring eyes. She is seeing on you the label friend. She sees you as lovely. She sees you as her friend. But you don't think, I'm friend. You're just you, Now, look at your enemy, and you can see by looking into their eyes, they're looking with daggers at you because you did cheat on him. You were mean to him, and he can't stand the sight of you. And you can tell by the way he's looking at you. So all he sees is ugly person. And then the person who doesn't know you very well is bored when they see you because you're a stranger. But from your point of view, you're not a stranger. You're not an enemy. You're not a friend. You're simply you. And you want to be happy and not want to suffer every second. It's another way of seeing it. It's obvious. These are artificial labels. There's a validity in a regular sense of you're my friend because you are kind to me and you do live with me. That's okay. But we're looking through the lenses of the delusions, attachment, aversion, and ignorance, So it's logical, but it's kind of hard. This is the starting point. It's upon this that you build each of the next steps, which we'll continue with next week. So any questions about that? So listen, see, this is the point about the wisdom wings necessary. Let's say I'm in this relationship with David and he's a mean guy and he dominates and bossy and bullies me and I'm this little pathetic victim and I cry and shiver and shake and I laugh. And, in other words, I'm suffering from attachment and neediness and expectations and I'm suffering from my pain and my jealousy. Then this, even just to get equanimity, is too advanced for me. My job is not to see that David wants to be happy just like everyone else. That's too advanced. I need to have enough self-courage, enough self-compassion to get the hell out of David's life. That's what I should be doing. So you've got to be knowing where you are at before you get even into the simple understanding of equanimity. It's an advanced practice. Because if you're sitting there being a victim to some brutal person, it doesn't help you if you're not working on your own mind first. You've got to put yourself together first and leave that damn relationship. That will be the most intelligent thing to do. So even just getting equanimity is quite intense. It's an intelligent recognition, you're getting yourself out of it. It's very powerful. You sure there's no questions before we finish? No. So, yeah, okay. All right. So I'll just mention the points we're going to go through in these 11 techniques. The next one, just briefly, we'll go through them. The next one, which sounds hilarious to us, actually, is it's the next point. And basically, you need a calculator for this one that goes, all sentient beings have been my mum, my mom, my mother. This is hilarious to us in the West because we're thinking, what am I supposed to do? Kind of hate everybody? Because we think our mums are the blame of all our suffering, the blame. But as long as it says, it's just a culture, it's just Indian Asian culture where you're using the mother as simply an example of someone who's nurtured you. And what we're trying to do here is expand our mind based upon beginningless mind, based upon the Buddha's view that we've got countless lifetimes, that simply all these countless sentient beings, we bumped into them countless times, and indeed they've all been my mother at some point. So it's kind of opening our mind to this profound possibility that all these beings whom we think of as enemies and friends and strangers have all been my mum. It's huge, And His Holiness says, well, if you don't like mum, think of anybody who's nurtured you. It's just an example, nothing kind of concrete about it. It's an example. Then the next point is really, we've got time to discuss that one now as well, just a little bit. The next one goes, the mother is kind. Now so there's two parts actually. 3A is the mother is kind. 3B is even more shocking. All sentient beings are kind. So we ought to look at that. So I think the very first thing we should look at is our definition of kind. And I think right now, frankly, our definition of kind is totally based on attachment. Because if I'm in the restaurant and I order my chocolate cake and you are the waitress and you're all nice to me and give me an extra piece and with extra cream on top and give me a discount, even if you think I'm a creep and you talk rudely about me to the cook, I don't care. I get what I want. So we mean when a person is kind to us sometimes, we mean they do what our attachment wants. It's very self-centered. Indeed, there can be, when you say, oh, she's such a kind person, there's a kind of some people have that aspect, don't they, being very kind. You have that. That's true. But here, the meaning isn't like this at all. The meaning here is the mother, or anyone for that matter, the very fact that they've done anything to facilitate your life, that's what's meant by kind. That's what's meant by kind. So that means straight away, your mum, who's probably an alcoholic or a junkie or self-centered or a narcissist or something, you think, don't be ridiculous, she's not kind. Well, I'm sorry, we've got to do an analysis here. And I think it's a really good meditation to do for all of us. What we're trying to do here basically is paint a new picture of our mother. Let's say it is our mother. Paint a new picture of her. Because what happens is this. When we're little, I remember vividly with my mum, I was in love with my mother. Basically, attachment ran the show. As far as I was concerned, my mother was perfect. And then I remember the moment she fell off the pedestal. I was probably 12 or something. I think these days mothers fall off the pedestal at the age of 3 or something. You know, you already want to sue your mother by the time you're 3. Well, I had to wait till I was 12 to find fault with my mother. You understand my point? And it was a shock to me. It was like I was criticizing God, but it was downhill from there. Once you start, you can't stop. I don't know how old I was, maybe 12, maybe 13. I don't remember. And so what happens is you start with attachment and your mum's divine, and then start to find fault, and then you get angry, and then that grows. And before you know it, the picture of your mum is as a horrible person. So when you got attachment, all you do is see the nice things. And when you got aversion, all you do is see the ugly things. And so often what happens is that's the picture that remains for some people until the day they die, and they never forgive their mums. It's heartbreaking. I mean, the number of mums who've come to me and talked and are brokenhearted because their daughter's given them up, just terrible suffering, blame them for all their sufferings is so common in our culture. It's heartbreaking. And so it's attachment and aversion. Now, this doesn't mean your mum wasn't horrible. Well, guess what? Join the human race, people. But, because we are so self-centered, my feeling is, and then because we assume our mother made us, literally created us, attachment's assumption is that she'd better be a perfect mother. How dare my mother be anything less than perfect? So that's why we're so shocked when our mother does something wrong to us. It's too shocking for our ego, it's very fascinating. But when you have the view of karma, it's completely different, because you created the cause to have that mother. So the exercise here is quite specific. Let's say your mum was a creep. Let's say she is narcissistic. Let's say she is neurotic and mean, and that can be perfectly possible. Let's say she is. It's especially good exercise to do, because the fact is, your mum, one of the first reasons you can be seeing your mother as kind, meaning she did something good for you, she didn't abort you. It's not meant to be a joke. I remember this fellow I met years ago in New Zealand who said when he was like 40, his mum suddenly announced to him that when he was in her womb, she had decided very clearly to have an abortion. She was in the hospital ready for the abortion. She stood up and had to go through some door. She remembers vividly taking hold of the handle of the door, and she stopped and she changed her mind. He was so unbelievably moved by that. He could not get over it, And this is not criticizing anybody who has an abortion. I mean, I've had an abortion. But the fact is, if we're alive, it means our mother didn't abort us. And like him, it might have been an option. Now, I remember a person I know well, doesn't matter who she is, about the same time as me in the 60s, I had an abortion, and I kept saying, have an abortion. It's all right. She was pregnant, right? And she decided consciously that she wouldn't do it. She was a Catholic. She was scared of losing the boyfriend, and it was not very good in the mates like 60s to have an abortion. To get pregnant, but she decided consciously, no, I will not have an abortion, and she gave birth to that baby, and then she gave it away. She decided she'd give it to a good family. Well, she met that child later, and that child resented her. Now, my feeling is this person I know was brokenhearted, Now, I know that she decided not to kill that child. She decided to give her away to a good family. But this child resents her. And many people who've been given away at birth feel the same way. Like they've been, what's the word we have? Abandoned, But the fact is, your mum didn't abort you. I find that so moving, actually. That is a profound reason, one reason to think, wow, that's incredible. That's one reason she's kind. Then you think of if she didn't give you away, and she gave birth to you, and she fed you, and she wiped your dirty bottom, and she tied your shoelaces, and she, looked after you, and you screamed, and all those things that she did, even when she was neurotic. I mean, they're all things she did that facilitated your life. You can't argue with that. So in a sense, it's like writing a new list of all the things that she must have done for you that helped you. Now, part of us goes, well, it's her job. That's not the point. Because the picture we have now is ugly mum who did nothing, who's mean and selfish. But if you start writing these new things down, what you're doing is painting a new picture of this woman. And suddenly, and many of my friends who are Buddhists have completely changed their view of their mother now. And even though she's the same neurotic person, they're seeing her through a different lens. It's a very powerful exercise, I tell you. Because aversion sees only the bad things, and attachment sees only the good things. And they're both self-centered. So adding karma to that, it makes a very different scenario. So it's a very powerful practice to see the mother as kind. So we'll stop there. All right. Thank you, darlings. So we dedicate all these 90 minutes, gone like a dream, all these thoughts we've had, these seeds we've planted. May we nourish them with our effort, our hard work, our practice, so that no matter how long they take, they will ripen just as we motivated as our Buddhahood for the sake of suffering sentient beings. Okay, that's it. That's all, everybody. And we'll look forward to next week and we'll continue. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Keep moving.
Thank
Keep it up.
you.
Thank you. That was
Thank
wonderful.
you.
Thank you, Robina.
Thank you,
Good to see
Venerable.
so much, Venerable.
Thank you.
Thank
That
you,
was really
John.
good.
Hi.